from the University of Miami. I'm a technician, and I want to go over sort of a quick nuts to bolts intro, very loosely formatted, on QuPath. The goal here is to be able to open an Olympus VSI file, incorporate into the QuPath, and do some fundamental analysis, basically counting cells and positive, negative, that sort of thing. Let's start with QuPath. QuPath, which you can find really quickly if you just type go into Google and just type QuPath. It'll bring you to a website. Within QuPath, you have this free open source software. It was produced a couple of years ago by the name of I believe it's Pete Bankhead. But the real value is you can take files from the Olympus VS120 scanner, which generates this pyramid platform. So it's a stacking of images. This file can actually open these OME TIFF, which is basically a non-proprietary format from the original Olympus software. And this will allow us to both analyze the data inside of QuPath, but also reformat it and into another open source software like ImageJ. Once you're in ImageJ, you can export it into any other format, and basically you can work with any image software out there, really. The issue is scaling these larger images down to a smaller usable format that's compatible with more common formats like TIFF and JPEG. The nice thing about the software, besides being free, of course, it also has its own YouTube page. If you type in QuPath on YouTube, you'll come to the home page, the main website. It actually encourages, I actually am going to subscribe to it. Anyway, as you can see, it's an extensive series of instructional videos that correspond to various functions buried within QuPath. The focus of today's talk is primarily the second series of tutorials looking at cell detection. You're actually walked through by the original programmer, Pete Bankhead, who actually wrote the connecting literature that goes with it. And there are links buried within each of these that will put you in contact with the reference material and the actual software and so forth and so on. Anyway, really available, very nice. And the guy has a rather pleasant British accent, probably a lot more concise and refined than my own. But anyway, it's definitely worth a look, especially if you have any questions beyond today's talk. Thank you. Hello, guys. So this is Isaac from the University of Miami. I thought I'd install. I've now gone to the website. I have downloaded the files. In this case, I've chosen to put them into a permanent location I want to share with a collaborator later on. So we go to the data file. Necessary software. Right now, because I use a PC, I only have a PC example to give you. In the Mac version, it's going to show up as a Mac PKG file, which I assume is a similar ready-to-run format. But basically, in the install, I have the ImageJ file, which is zip, and the Olympus viewer, which we're not going to cover today. And then we have the QuPath. QuPath is ready to run. So basically, all we do is, let me complete this, don't blame that. All we need to do is click on the QuPath. The file menu will open up. You'll see Welcome to QuPath 2.0. You hit Next. Mine's already installed, so it's going to ask about removing and whatever, okay, let's say repair for right now. But you're not repairing, you're installing. But just because I'm reinstalling over something that already exists. So it does its little process, and we're done. And as far as opening a file, all you have to do now is click on QuPath. Now you just open up the window of the file you want to play with. So in this case, I grab an image. Doesn't really matter which one, but I think I'll start with this one because we play with it later on. I think let's do insulin. Insulin's fun. Everybody knows what insulin looks like. Here. So we're going to look at, here's a VSI file. So anybody who's used the Olympus VS120, knows that the machine by default will generate a machine encoded. In this case, you can actually see the name of the internal files, OSE04, count off, date of, and the slide location. This is default by the software. I've actually renamed these by hand for my collaborator. But basically, you go in the folder, and there will be a number of files. These are basically internal. If you were to go to the overview overview shot you get when you open up the Olympus viewer. But in this case, we're just going to take the VSI file, which is basically the linking file. We're going to drag it into QuPath. And what it'll do is it'll show you the several possible internal scans that are stored within the file. The first is a recognition of the header of the slide, which is stored in every QuPath file. I'm sorry, every VS120 file. An overview of the slide, and then generally regions that are highlighted by either the contrast detection or the operator's selection. It maintains each of these files separately. So if you want to open it, we just click on the file and you're ready to go. Now, while this is possible to do it this way, I'm actually going to show you another process. It's actually a better process utilizing projects. But I think I'm going to cover that in the next section. You have a nice day, and thank you for checking me out. Hello, this is Isaac Snowhite from the University of Miami, and I'm back again. Today, right now we're going to discuss opening QuPath and initiating a project. So, the basic premise behind QuPath is that, the basic structure of QuPath, this piece of software, is basically a database. So essentially what it does is it takes the VSI files that I drag into it, it maps them out, and then generates a collection of smaller databases of information. So the idea being that, I have my original Olympus scans stored in one folder in one file location. This will be permanent. Then I will generate a second folder with the QuPath projects. What these represent are, in this case, I've chosen to use the individual engines I'm screening for. It's just a way of organizing it. Within each file is the actual project, which is going to contain the links to all the raw data listed in the VS120 scan. A series of subfolders, but basically this is effectively your database. So if you drag this into here, this will open up and generate a list of all the files, the links, and within each of these, you actually have the raw data. Here, one second, I'll click on one and show you what I'm talking about. The raw data along with the image. There's just one sec, it takes a minute. So this is the actual slide from above with the new overlays. And as you can see, as you import this, and actually we'll go through this process in just a second, you can build and keep on adding until you have hundreds of slides. But the key point is that the actual image, this underlying image, is just an imported image from the previous directory. So this is why it's important to maintain directory location. There are ways to relink it, just like you would with, say, a program like Lightroom or Premiere for video, or a lot of other basically large file database software where you're basically initiating changes on a virtual copy of something that's stored in a larger location. Now, with that being said, let's start over. I'm going to start fresh. We're going to open a new database. And we're going to store it in this case, just because I just want to run a dry run here. We're going to put a new database, create a new project. In this case, I'm going to specify the drive, here, QuPath. I'm going to try test, select folder. So now we have a database, and it's automatically saved as we move along. Everything we do in here is stored. All the workflow and all the image links are automatically stored. So basically, the prior VS120 scan folder, like I had before, we're going to start with insulin just because of the first slide in the group. We're going to take the VSI file, like I said before in the prior talk. We're going to drag this onto the QuPath window and say, yes, import. Now, what it imported, actually, maybe we're done it automatically. We'll see. Let's go ahead and generate two, just for giggles. I want to see if another window opens up. One quick thing. Once we can hit save real quick. It actually already has saved this file, but basically, what I recommend doing when you first pull the files in is going through and just checking on the information coming in. So If you remember, the VSIs generate several folders. There's typically a shot of the label taken by the camera. There's an overview shot that the VSI or Olympus VSI 120 takes of the entire slide from the label down. And then there are the areas identified by the contrast by the operator or by the software, in which is normally the close-up, basically, the high-resolution image. In some cases, most cases, this works it's fairly straightforward, but in some cases, there are additional zones that maybe were identified by the software and not by the user that are stored. I recommend taking this opportunity to sort of clean up and remove those files so you have a nice clean database to play with. Also, if you need to label your, I'm sorry, what I'm doing here is I'm opening another file. I can't delete something while I'm laying on top of it. Particularly, I'm going to open the file, I'm right-clicking and going to hit delete image, and just going to remove that from the database. So the point is now we have a list, in this case, 2 slides. I keep these files because this actually has, in case there's a mistake made in the loading of the machine or copying the database names into the file structure, automatically built-in safety showing you exactly what was on the slide based on the way the slide was labeled. So anyway, we can right-click these, we can rename the image, we can add metadata, we can edit descriptions, we can sort, we can duplicate images, all sorts of fun things. So anyway, for right now, let's focus on the first image here. So by default, the image is going to try to, since it's a mixed chemical, it's going to try to associate the file with a color pattern. The built-in options are bright field, hematoxylin and DAB, hematoxylin, isin, bright field other, fluorescence and others. These are nice because they're not necessarily quantitative, but they have built-in filters already established as a starting point for the analysis. In this case, we're doing H&E. So we're going to click on H&E, and that information is actually stored in the associated values stored with the image when we once we save it and store it, it'll keep coming back to this. Now, these are the, I guess, color vector coordinates, the red, the green, the blue, that are stored for each of the color profiles. And these can be referenced by pushing 1 through 4 keys on your screen above. So 1 is basically all colors are visible. 2 is the hematoxylin in this case. 3 is the 3 is the eosin. 4 is going to be this referential residual. There's actually a high contrast on 5, which is basically just lights and darks. And then 6 is like a counter overlap. It's sort of like a Gaussian blur where it kind of takes the average of the color from that region and can be useful for like distinguishing overlaps in color for, like, say, dual staining. But for H&E, right now it's pretty straightforward 2-color comparison. So let's go back to overview. So if we were to zone in on these, we can actually look under, this is a little button up here. This is the contrast. And what this does is allows you to actually pick those channels that I was referencing to using the numbers. You have the hematoxylin, you have the eosin, and these are the 2 we're going to focus on. Now, this is basically for our sake, we can actually modify these reference numbers in case there's a slight difference in color choice. There could be differences in intensity or slight shifts in color due to the acidity when things were stained. You can actually reestablish these reference numbers by clicking on them. Here, let's click on this for a second. So we hit hematoxylin, and see we can actually enter new values. I'm not going to touch the versions that are stored, but we could actually, like, say, create an IVS copy and then modify the actual reference values for this. I'm not going to do that right now. What we can do also is estimate vectors. If we don't know what those vector scores are, cancel. What we're going to do here, what I'm going to do is we're going to go out. We're going to pick an area where we have overlap between the background and the stain. So we want to take a square, a section. There's a background and stain. And we can go to pre-process, and we can actually look at analyzing the vector locations of each of the colors. And basically, these are measurements of where the red and green fall. You could do it physically, manually, sorry, not physically, manually, by manipulating these sticks around. But the trick is that it's actually kind of difficult to align things on a 3-dimension because of the way the vector works. There's an automatic button which actually does a pretty good job. And there's a way to modify the estimate made by the software. You can increase like the margins of error for the outliers, for example. And it'll shift the auto. So it'll move it in, so it'll take the outliers out of the equation. For now, we're just gonna say 1%. There's my ASIN. And now you can go to the contrast. And if you want to, you can kind of play with this with the contrast. And theoretically, you can select like by color, but I would never really rely on this, honestly. We're going to use the optical limits for ours, but it does give. It's nice to just kind of see auto. Hematoxin is actually pretty dark. Not a problem. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at actual cell detection. So what we're going to do here is we're going to zoom in. I'm going to expand this out. Got a few cells in there. And I'm going to opt to detect the cells. Let me just close this file, make this bigger for everybody to see. I'm going to hit Control L or Command L, and what comes up is the command list. Now, all these commands actually have links in the menus, but the author actually suggests just using this because it tends to be a little bit easier to get through. So for example, I want to do cell detection. Just type in cell, and oh, there we go, there's cell detection. So we're going to click on cell detection. And actually, we can skip this lesson for today because I just want to expedite. We're going to do cell detection, but with positive-negative selection. So this is where we're going to focus on for right now. So as you can see, we have a much larger section. But because of processing power required to analyze these sections, it's better to sort of optimize your preliminary scan and your settings on a smaller section. Ideally, it's nice to pick something where you have a little background mixed in, maybe some connective tissue. Basically all your options, because you want to refine your selections and maximize the ability of the software to sort of pick out your targets, basically. So the first thing here is we have two options. The detection image, it can utilize the hematoxylin as a reference for the background, or it can utilize direct density sum. Both options are viable. Hematoxylin is going to try to utilize the selection data we used before in the contrast. It's not necessarily the best option, but it's a place to start, and sometimes it's a good plan B to see how the gating actually works out. So let's start with that. So you hit run, the software runs, and you can see here's its first attempt at trying to identify nuclei based on default settings. It obviously did a pretty horrible job here with the stained tissue. There's obviously a lot of regions that are not highlighted. And part of this is dictated by the fact that this all operates on top of the threshold. So what it's doing is it's taking a look at the base threshold, everything above that, and trying to subcategorize background from that. So let's, just out of curiosity, take a look at the optical density version to see how it varies. And actually, you can see it actually did a much better job identifying the target areas. The purple areas in this software are sort of defaulted as the background, and the, well, colored in this case, sorry, they're all colored, I guess, but yellow, orange, or red are your threshold colors, basically. And I'll show you how to pick up the regions as we move along. But basically, the second row is your relative requested pixel density. The software by default, here we go, gives you an actual average pixel width here of like say 0.69. It's like a subset. And oh, here, sorry, actually, let's try annotations, hierarchy. Okay, let's try under annotations. I thought it was originally listed there, but anyway, maybe it is under a project image. It's giving you the idea of the relative pixel thickness. I think the actual baseline pixel thickness is at one. Here, let's try 0.6916. Run. This is basically the higher resolution, highest resolution. It takes a little more processing power, but basically it's the highest resolution in which the software, not the actual image, but the software sees the image. This actually can fluctuate somewhat, and I'm not sure this is actually the best example, but basically the idea here is the lower you set this, the closer you make this, the more scanned cube squares we're going to generate to try to take the entire image, and the more processing power it's going to take. So generally, for time's sake, I generally set this to 1, and you'll see why in a second, or not in a second, but as we move through this. But basically, you're more likely to pick up, I guess, some of these micro features with a higher resolution image instead of downscaling first. But it's also going to like strangle your machine later on as we move forward. So what you have to understand is the basic background it's pulling out all the, trying to estimate cell structure, the roundness of the structure, or the center of the nucleus is based on where the threshold starts. As you can see within this, it seems to be missing, you know what, actually it's not doing a horrible job, but it's missing some of these internal structures. If we were to set this to 0, for example, this basically removes the gating tendency, and so everything's limited to just the threshold. If you set this higher, basically it's subtracting that background. I think 8 was what we had before, and we hit run, and you see here, I'm going to right-click on the mouse, go down to just nuclei, and see how it highlights the structure, the nuclei structure. It actually doesn't seem to be doing too bad a job, honestly. What this does basically is the software is looking for the nuclei. It's then looking for the threshold measurement outside of that nuclei. So if you set this too low, basically it's just looking at the pixel next to the point of reference. As you set this higher, it's looking outside of this diameter for that reference. And so theoretically, you can see it's actually expanding out. It's trying to, let's try lowering this down to 0.05. This is a starting point anyway. So I'm going to right click and bring that cell wall back. Okay, so right now that's a little dense, maybe a little too dense. Here, just so we can see. So what this is, okay, sorry. So first we've tried to clarify where the centers are, the nuclei are, and this is doing an okay job. One of the things you can do is you can specify the minimum surface area of that nuclei. So if you increase that nuclei size to too large, it'll actually eliminate a possible reference. But the point is, it's also nice because you can actually eliminate some of the background, unintentional background standing within this. Here, let's try it run. So basically what I'm hoping is by setting this at a high enough level, I'm sort of eliminating, and you'll see in a larger one, like debris from, say, these internal sections in here. 5. Let me try 20. Run. Shit looks, so not really having a massive effect, honestly. Out of curiosity, hematoxylin and eosin optical. Okay, so it doesn't appear to be having a massive effect on the reference for background. It's partially because I have the threshold set so low. If we bring this back up to, say, 0.1 where it was, yeah, there we go. Actually, it still looks better. Basically, the hematoxylin should, in theory, I'm going to hit D here and remove. You can see the nuclei. Now, the issue is you can see within these nuclei, under this overlap, maybe because they're dividing or overlapping structures, but they actually seem to be doing a decent job highlighting just the nuclei. So if we put the cell walls back in place, or the estimated cell boundary, Now we have cell parameter expansion. So what this is just an estimation from a nucleus distance. It is not critical, but it's more critical if you're trying to look at like markers that are out to the edge of the cell. In our case, it's probably not horribly critical in this case. We're doing something where it's kind of cytoplasmic by nature. But the idea is it's looking at proximity, and it's drawing sort of an imaginary line out from the center. And where this becomes important is if you're looking at something that's membrane bound. So basically, let's say you're looking at a receptor, but you want to identify the color, and do a count, but you don't want to overlap two different cells within one cell count. So you want to define an outer perimeter for the cell itself. So let's say it's 10. Hit run. So you can see we've missed a few. Actually, by and large here, we go back to D, come back. I'm going to go back down to 0 for a second. I just want to see what we got here. Run. I'm going to set this about 5. To be honest, it's a little difficult to interpret with this tissue where I actually don't believe we have clean cell membranes, but the nuclei itself I actually trust based on the initial image. Most of it, not all of it, but most of it. We're going to display cell boundary. We're going to expand this out so we have a little more character to read. I don't know if it looks better per se, but I think it makes me feel like I'm getting a better sense of what's going on. So as you move down, you could do smooth boundaries. Basically, it shows you what the actual software is looking at, what it's physically looking at for those pixels. It's more of a cosmetic feature. Obviously, we want to make measurements, so I'm going to leave that one untouched at the moment. For a measurement of intensity, this is where it's taking an average of what it's perceiving to be the nucleus or the surrounding cytoplasm within the surface area. We're looking at eosin as our focus, and for most of what I'm doing in my project, I'm focusing either at cytoplasmic or cell. As you can see, it highlights the things that are above those thresholds. In this case, the default color is red, but if you uncheck the single threshold, what it will do is it'll actually generate a gradation based on relative intensity. So we hit run. So in this case, here, we hit D. I see two things. I'm looking at this piece of an islet, and the brown is denoting the insulin staining within. It's not a particularly pretty one, but it is a good place to start. And here, let's look at this guy up here. And we can see two things for our initial guess. The first thing is we're losing some of these nuclei from the H and E, or actually a little bit on the faint side. So we can push this down to say, let's try 0.05. And then hit run. And then look at it, and then, okay, there we go. Now the software is seeing those nuclei. It's seeing these, or trying to see the nuclei within the actual islet. Now, this is the part where it's a bit subjective, okay? With all this stuff, there's always a little bit of sort of where do you define your cut points. We know the background is reasonably low, and we're not seeing a lot of non-stained areas that are actually coming back as yellow. We may want to push this down and push the threshold for the top a little bit further down. And the reason I'm saying that is because my perception of the stain is that basically this is probably the most saturated region, or most saturated the stain's capable of, and it's barely being detected. So let's try pushing these thresholds back down, say 4, 3, 3, and right now the default is 2. And so from this, you can see that within the stain, there's actually regions that are a little more intensely labeled with the precipitant, and you get a little more gradation. And what's nice about this is if you look at within the data sets. Okay, so we have the project, we have the image data we saw before for the separation, and now we have the annotation and hierarchy. Annotation and hierarchy basically are these sections for drawing off and labeling and numbering. Within the annotation tab, you actually have a representative image or scale, drawing of the cell and its count, so you can identify every cell that's counted. Each one of these is actually linked to an individual Excel row buried within the data set. But for right now, you just get the idea that this is basically all of your count area. This is a summary here. So we have the yellow is represented by the number 1, the orange is represented by number 2, and number 3 is your red. So right now what this is saying is there are 13 red cells in this square. There are a total of 2,800 cells, and approximately 2% of the population is coming back positive for being above threshold. The area, this is in square micrometers, is about almost like 400,000 square micrometers and perimeter. So the reason for me showing you this is you can imagine how useful this is. You can see there's actually a maintenance of scale all through this, which is a considerable improvement over my other older methods where I'm taking files, exporting them into a secondary format, trying to mask out a specific color, select a color out so I can then import it into image J. Meanwhile, I'm losing all of this metadata related to scale. So it becomes this whole process to try to scale the image back in. So this idea of surface area, or even just an idea of an average cell number, is something that's actually quite difficult to do once you start stripping all the metadata away from the initial image. Now, once we have a feeling that we have something we wanna try out with a larger scan, what I recommend doing is going back here, and we're going to go to objects. We're going to delete the scan. Now, one word of advice. There are 2 ways to do this. The first one is, and probably the easiest way to do this, is simply to copy. And in Windows, you can go to Snippet. There's an inbuilt screen grab tool. You can highlight your numbers. And then we can use these for the next scan. We do the larger tissue. A second option is if you ever lose your information, if you have every step you've done here is actually stored in your history workflow, the one at the bottom is the most recent one, and that's going to have all of your threshold and boundary data plugged in. So I click on this. There you go. There's your number. It's already stored. The issue is just knowing where you're going to find it in the workflow. But in this case, since it was the last thing you did, then it's not quite so difficult. But anyway, let's go back. Let's go back to the hierarchy. Let's delete the file. In this case, we don't want to keep the reference information. And the reason for doing this is, in general, my experience is to try to keep this fairly simple. This window, and Pete also said this as well in his YouTube videos, basically said this version of the software, you have to imagine it's generally geared to hold maybe 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 events. And what we're about to do is we're going to scan an area of like millions. So essentially the little script is kind of unstable. And so it's better if you just kind of limit your analysis to sort of one set at a time and then move within. But don't try to load up too many feet. Don't try to load up too much work from data coming out of this hierarchy. I know it sounds weird, but just work with me on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of these tools up here. Remember, square, circle, line. I like parabola. Parabola allows me to, if you click down and drag the image around your target, this does pretty much what you expect. It filters out all the debris. You obviously don't want to highlight like the wax pencil from a section, especially if it happens to be the same color as you're trying to use for your color, for positive, negative. But it also expedites your work a bit because it cuts down on the number of tiles this thing's going to generate in order to quantify the area. Also, and we will get into this, this is something where I haven't really played with it. I still embrace encompassing pretty much all the tissue. We done? You can actually correct this using this brush tool. You can push things out. I haven't figured out how to push things back in. In this case, it looks like we're okay around the edges more or less. But anyway, once you've highlighted the area you want to highlight, you hit Control L again. We're going to see our commands come back up. We're going to hit positive selection. We're going to then enter the numbers and the settings we used in the prior screen. We're going to set it to 1 because well, 1, it just takes forever to process. But 2, the amount of gain you get from that is fairly small, honestly. The resolution, even at a scaled down version, is actually pretty nice. 0.5. And again, this isn't affecting the image. It's just what the image is taking into account for the scan. So we have 0.2. So we lowered this to 0.3 and 0.4. And we focused on using the ease. So anyway, once we have all that done, we can blow this up. We can push run. And for this first one, I'm going to make you guys sit through it because I want you to get an idea of the amount of time it takes for the software to go through the process. If I think I may try to edit this, maybe put the files together. I'll speed up some of the repeats we're going to do. This first pass is just to see how the overall scans work under the conditions we defined in that first attempt. And so what I'm concerned about is if you can see the base is tissue, I can see we have this connective tissue, maybe fat or maybe damage that was done during the mounting. And these areas happen a lot in immunohistochemical staining, and they generally, I don't think these are actually islets that are standing right down here. I think they're probably deposition of precipitant from the secondary. But anyway, I'll show you how we can try to clean some of that up or whether it's even important in the big picture. But one obvious thing you can do is trying to clip it out in the beginning. There's probably a number of tools built in if you go to the main website where you can actually you can refine your selection more so. But honestly, for large scale scannings of hundreds of sections, I try not to do this too much because the more you try to manipulate the image by controlling sections that are scanned or not, as long as they're within the parameters of the screen, the more likely you are to generate artifacts. So I kind of like the idea of a gross number. It's really very reproducible and representative of the data set. We're almost there. Oh, and to give you an idea, this is a Windows machine, several years old. It's got an i7 970 or 9700K processor. So they're a 3 or 4 year old processor, and it's got a GPU. But honestly, I have a GTX 1070 Ti. You do a little bit of video editing, but honestly, the GPU is not so utilized. What is utilized is RAM. This unit has 64 gigs of RAM, and the software actually defaults to 32 by default. So if you have a smaller machine, it will run, but it's going to take a lot longer to render. So if we go into the image, oh wow, we have a lot of red here. Oh, I see why. I made a mistake. I forgot to unclick the single threshold. So let's try rerunning this. Actually, let's take a quick look around. Overall, again, if we hit Control D, just D, we have here. Let me get closer. It's not horrible. It's highlighted most of our intended regions. It's cut out some of the background areas that are negative, that are not actually stained. We haven't seen the hierarchy because like I said, I made a mistake with the setting. And one other thing I may mess with is the trying to remove these areas that I don't actually believe are probably nucleated, and maybe just artifacts within the image. But for right now, actually, you know what? We'll do two things. This first thing, I know what's going to happen. It's going to generate a color hierarchy based on threshold. But let's also play around with the minimum diameter. Let's pump this up to like 50. And so this ensures there's sort of a minimum size for the nuclei for the selection, and maybe gives a little cleaner image. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and hit run. Okay, so by increasing the nuclei minimum, we seem to have lost a lot of the sections, but not a big deal because we can always just go back to what we had before. I think we had, actually I have it here. We had 20 is our default. So let's put back down to 20 where we had it, which was fine actually. It gave us a few more false positives for negative cell populations. But the color, let's look at the color for a second. Okay, so you can see right here where we're going. So what I was missing here was the reds, blues, the greens, so forth and so on. Let's try rerunning this with the conditions and clean it up. Okay, I'm not mad with this. Now we have the prior color selection like we had before. And let me back out here for a second. Most of the open areas, the artifacts aren't being picked up. They're not really labeling. There is some staining here, which I think may be difficult to eliminate completely, other than through manipulation of this background parameter because of the nuclei. But I think the intensity is always going to be a problem because of the intense color. One other option here, other than using light, like I said, was to try the H&E stain. But you can see how colored debris from the, and again, in the big picture, honestly, it's really not that big a deal. We're talking about what's the effective count here? It's like 8,000 events of the yellow, 8,000 events of the orange, 13,000, this is what we really care about anyway, really is the high expressing levels. And the relative percentage frequency is like 2%, which is about what you'd expect actually for a healthy human pancreas, which I believe this is control. The only margin of error you're talking about is the total cell count, which in this case you're talking about like 1.5 million cells. So if there's a few 100,000 cells in here, it's not even a percentage point on the on the big picture. But like I said, this is the part where you can sit and play with this for a while. So with that being said, I think I'm going to stop for dinner, and just before we go, let me try one more option here. We will try the hematoxylin stain as a counter, because one of the things I did notice, the hematoxylin does not stain this connective tissue as well. And so it may help distinguish the hematoxylin stained sections, may help distinguish the islets from this connective tissue. It is also labeled with the secondary. But I'm afraid it also might compromise the counts inside the islets. So it's a trade-off. And there's certainly room to play with the parameters and refine. But honestly, I'm reasonably happy with the prior score, even with the imperfections of the base. Because in the big picture, you're talking about a level of precision. I can tell you, doing anything over 1 million by hand, well, you can guess. More importantly, you'll see as we move back that the software is fairly precise. So once for any given section, once those things are dialed in, it's essentially going to give you roughly the same account every time at a far higher frequency rates in refinement than hand counting, because you are just talking about so many events. And here's what I'm talking about. So you can see that basically all of this secondary tissue, all this like raw tissue is basically going unlabeled, which is good. Now we're having problems with the problems with the staining within the islets themselves. The problem with the secondary is you tend to lose a lot of the shape of the actual cells in the scan, and so basically it just becomes kind of messy. I'd rather have preserve that those islets structure, areas where you have heavier precipitant formation, and have a few negative connective tissue counts, than risk losing my islets in this case. And again, you could refine all of this. There may be ways to delete regions, which I have not gone into yet. But honestly, if you're going to start doing this for large batches of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slides, you probably want to stick to a fairly flat protocol you can apply uniformly. And as you can see, even with this one slide, I haven't looked at the clock yet to see where we're on time, but you can see that it's actually fairly time intensive, but far faster than the alternative, which was, like I said before, me basically going through this, exporting this file into a Photoshop where I'm essentially doing a very similar process of trying to mask a single channel out, sort of the equivalent of pushing the second number 2 or number 3 key on this keyboard. And the issues of those artifacts are still there. You still have those brown patches or folds or scratches that are going to show up in the mask, and then trying to set a threshold. So essentially doing what this thing does already, but without the advantages of having the metadata for the surface area pre-embedded, using a downscaled image, and also unable to track the artifacts back to the original image, because these are simply masks on top of masks, or masks on top of original images, as opposed to this where you can actually reference each individual cell within the count. So if there's any questions about a given event, you can just becomes nearly impossible to reference it again. So once this flatlines, I'll show you guys where the raw data is, and we'll go from there. And as you can see, it's, again, keys here. You have D, which removes all the labeling. You have F, which fills. And it's nice for, just getting rough surface areas, kind of getting rid of that background. As you can see, it does get a little busy. And there's actually ways in the software to map. Here. And like I said, these are the areas where there's the most room for correction. Basically, you could, this is probably actually about right. This is actually tissue, but this other stuff, it's really hard to tell if it's real or not, honestly. Some of this is obviously or probably not nuclei. Actually, you know what? We'll play with this a little bit more. I might as well finish this off for the tutorial. So let's try pushing this up to 30. We saw 50 is too high. Let's try 30. Most of these artifacts are pretty small, so I'm hoping that they will essentially disappear into the background. Oh, actually, it looks like it, let's see, the cell's back in. It looks like it did a decent job. Here. This is sort of where it gets a little back and forth. Let's try 25. Run. Okay. Okay. So actually, that doesn't look too bad. Let's try. I'm going to move back to nuclei only because it's a little easier to see. And you can see in the connective tissue, it's actually not quite so bad. You can see that it's highlighting basically things it thinks it might be cells. There's a connective tissue running through. It looks like it missed some of this, some of these low level. I don't know what this is actually, to be honest. And again, this is a problem with partially with the sections as well. You can see this sort of uneven staining. Some of it's actually physically, it looks like physical tears in the sections where you can see an eyelid's split. But you know what? Not bad. I see it looks like the speckling I'm expecting the connective tissue. Let's look at this one a little closer. There's an eyelet, kind of fuzzy. The second thing is, and then this is not unique, this may be partially the scope, but actually a lot of these sections, I noticed that whether it's a preservation issue or, I'll go back, the cell wall back in, these particular sections, the staining is a little on the faint side some areas. So it's actually just below threshold. So it's sort of nebulous. So, I mean, part of it is the software, part of it is the tissue. It's just the way it is, and the effectiveness of the stain. But by and large, I trust the rough numbers. And again, when it's all said and done, it's basically, even with the refinement and the loss of a little bit of a color, it looks like I'm going to come in around 2% again, 1.95. Okay. Well, anyway, I think that'll do it for this particular lesson. Oh, here we go. Here we go. One sec. Okay, this is not good. Let's go back down to 20, because basically I'm afraid of, or don't want to lose, my nuclei within the islets. And then I promise you we will then discuss the output numbers. So within the image, you have this hierarchy image in the annotation here. Annotation is 80 objects. This will actually map out to like an Excel format that has a copy of all the data stored in this hierarchy. And you can, of course, export it, graph it. It's got a few basic graphic functions. You can actually map the different colors with the software. So if you had, like, say, a nuclei to cytoplasm ratio, and you wanted to see how it distributes within a section, you can actually let it sort of pick out the colors or grade, and has a lot of nice, like, display functions built into it. But that's beyond the scope of what I'm going to cover tonight. I think this is it, and then I'm going to show you the numbers, and then we will close down. And well, anyway, it's a good starting point. It's almost there. Okay, there we go. So my nucleus is back in. It looks a little busier than before, and that's the difference of just here. Let's get rid of the fill. Just go down the nuclei again. So right click on your mouse, hit nuclei only. I see what I'm mostly worried about here with the nuclei, like I said, is this connective tissue, and I can see. Well, anyway, like I said, it's a trade-off. pushes our percentages up because we're encompassing a slightly larger section of islets, and which is why I'm focusing on them primarily. They are my they are my bread and butter in the end. But put the cell wall back in, cell boundaries, and you get an idea of what the islets are, the relative intensity. So, last little bit here. If you go under TMA information, you can do annotation is basically this output. It's useful for, say, copying the files into Excel. You can do a clipboard and copy, and there's your ROIs, and your category numbers, your percentages. You can go to analyze. Where do I put it? Measure TMA under. What was I looking here? Oh, sorry. Here, TMA detection measurements, and this is, like I said, it's all the data stored in this annotation file. Again, same idea. You can plot, like, normalize cell counts. You can do, let's say cell to nuclear ratios. You can do plots of area. Say cytoplasm to eosin stains. You can see counts for each of the. Let's see. I don't know, perimeters. Cell perimeter. You could do. Oh, here, nuclei, cell area. You can see cell distribution of cell nuclei area. You can actually use this probably the refining. You can control the number of bins it's shoved into before. So you increase the segmentation, get a higher resolution. Obviously, you do clipboard expansion, take all that out. There is, I think, L. You have mapping. Show we can measurement map based on, let's see, nuclei in eosin means. You can do like gradations in color. You can like show highlight areas inside a tissue. You can do, well, anyway, you can see there's a lot of options. But anyway, you guys, we go back to project, and we're back where we started. And the beautiful thing is, all you have to do now is hit save and close the file, and all this stuff is nicely tucked away. And when you come back tomorrow or whenever, and you want to go back in and figure out how to, well, besides filling out your data set, so all your sections you want for under any given stain, before you export everything, you can go back under workflow. You can find your settings for prior versions. You can, if you want to, you can get really fancy, start labeling tissue based on specific stains. But again, that's beyond the scope of this talk. I just want to know it's out there. And like I said, I can't thank the author enough, and I'm hoping this is helpful. And if you have any questions, just leave a comment below, and I will get to them as, well, as soon as I can, more or less. You have a nice night.